Today we're doing the Sam Bankman-Fried sentencing post-mortem. It was the sentencing that occurred last week, and we're going to go through all the ins and outs of what happened. I'd like to start by reading you a quote from the judge, Judge Lewis Kaplan of the Southern District of New York. This is what Judge Kaplan said at the end of the proceeding. He said, "At the end of the day, the criminal justice system in this country, or any country, can enjoy the support of the population, which is essential to its functioning in more ways than I could describe, only if on the whole people think it works fairly, that guilty people get their just deserves, that innocent people aren't wrongly convicted, and they can get their arms around the case as they hear about it. Say, well, I might have decided that a little differently, but sounds reasonable, sounds fair. That's what we depend on. If that's not happening, we're back to trial by combat, folks, or something like it." Just a hunch, but do you think the judge was talking about a little something bigger than the Sam Bankman-Fried case?
So, let's have trial by combat.
Over 1 million Americans face sentencing every year, and it will be the most important day of their lives. But we don't fully understand the system, how broken it is, and what we can do to make it better. I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year criminal defense lawyer and a sentencing expert. My goal is to bring more awareness, more fairness, and more humanity to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing. Hey everybody, Doug Passon coming to you from Studio 3553 in Scottsdale, Arizona. It is March 29th, 2024, Friday afternoon, and I am here with my good friend and colleague, Mark Allenbaugh. Hello, Mark Allenbaugh.
Hello, Doug. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. We are here to discuss what else. Yesterday, the sentencing for Sam Bankman-Fried happened in the Southern District of New York. Judge Kaplan imposed a 25-year sentence for Sam Bankman-Fried. Now, we had previously done full-on podcasts while he was in trial. We made some predictions about sentencing. You know, we've been following this very closely, and we got the transcript from the sentencing yesterday. Both of us have reviewed every word of it, so we are really ready to dig in and do what we like to call our sentencing post-mortem. We got to look at anything that went right or anything that went wrong and give our 2 cents about the whole big picture and see what we as lawyers or clients can glean from the things that happened in this case to make us better. And so we have a lot to talk about. There's so many moving pieces here in this sentencing. So I don't even know where to start. Oh, wait, I do know where to start. Since it is Friday afternoon, I'm starting with a drink. And I don't have any pithy thing to connect this brand of tequila that I'm drinking today to the subject matter. I can only say this is a series of events that just requires a little bit of a little tequila first. So here we go. This is Lalo.
A little tequila on Good Friday.
Yeah. Oh, well, you know, that's for your people, not mine, baby. Lalo, though, highly recommend. Love this. Anyway, it's probably, just FYI, it's probably the best Blanco you could ever get for this price point. It's only like a $45 bottle. You don't have to spend a lot of money on Blanco,
though. I have to get
no,
you off the Blanco.
The Blanco is the essence. It's the purest expression of the agave plant before you put it in a barrel and mix all the flavors up.
Purity is overrated.
Oh my gosh. Well, let's talk about the impurities of the sentencing guidelines.
Yes.
I don't know where to start.
Well, I know where to start. First of all,
good.
You were right.
Cheers.
I was wrong.
Cheers. Oh, that's a very good place to start.
Yeah, so
this should be a bottle of tequila that I'm drinking that was provided by you, because I believe that was our bet. We were gonna.
That was our bet. I owe you a bottle of tequila for sure. But yeah, you had bet somewhere around I think you said 20 to 25 years, somewhere in that neighborhood, and I was at 12 to 15 years, and you had given me the option of
amending my prediction, but I stood fast at 12 to 15 years. But in my defense, I thought somebody was going to be using some statistics and sentencing and inform
Okay.
the court about some
Yeah.
stuff. And that, unfortunately, we'll talk about that, but there was a lost
Yeah.
opportunity there. But at any rate,
Well, I think you and I will agree that there
yeah,
was more than one
yeah,
lost opportunity here.
yes,
And listen, I will preface this by saying, yes, we're doing Monday morning quarterback, Friday
yeah,
afternoon quarterbacking,
yeah,
and there's always a story behind the story about why a lawyer might have included something or might have left something on the cutting room
right,
floor. So
right, of course,
there's so much of a second guessing we can do. Second thing I want to say is, even though we're kind of joking about making bets and everything else, my heart's going out to Sam Bankman-Fried and his family and everybody who
yeah.
loves him, who has got to be just reeling today. And I know there's a lot of people in who've been looking on from the sidelines saying, "Oh, poor him, he deserves every bit of it." I don't think he does. I don't think either of us did, and I think we were both on the same page that 25 years is not
It's
justice.
excessive. Yeah,
It's not
it's
justice.
not justice, and it's excessive.
So where do
And
we start?
well, what one of the things that I think a general observation, just to go on, or to tag along what you said, there are obviously a number of people, and rightly so, that are very upset with him, that are very upset with not Sam Bankman-Fried, but Caroline and everybody else that was running FTX or Alameda.
Yep.
And and that's completely understandable and very justified. But with that said, the purpose of sentencing isn't just to vindicate, if you will, people's sensibilities or our sensibilities of justice. That's not its only purpose. That is a purpose, if you will, to make sure that defendants receive their just deserts, as we may say, as the
Yeah.
philosophers say. But that is not, the only purpose. There are many, many, many other purposes. And I will just say this, that and we'll just obviously be discussing this quite a bit, but merely because others have received higher sentences than Sam Bankman-Fried did yesterday, such as Bernie Madoff, and have engaged in similar conduct and received higher sentences, that doesn't mean that those sentences were justified, or that Sam Bankman-Fried, we'll just call him SBF for short, received a break here. And so I think that's is something that people need to take into consideration, and also the fact that the guidelines were calling for 110 years, and
Yeah.
that he got 25 years was a break or any show of mercy. As we'll see, it wasn't. It was
Yeah.
still extremely excessive, and that's, I think, part of the culture, the incarceration. We live in an incarceration nation, especially at the federal level. So it's so easy for us to speak in years, and 5 years, and 10 years, and 15 years, because we see this all the time, and we get jaded, especially judges. Judges get jaded. They hand out 5, 10-year, 15, 20-year sentences every day.
Yeah.
But that is absurd. That's an absurd amount of
Yeah.
time when compared to the way we used to do it in this country,
Yeah.
and the way other countries still do it. And that's one of the reasons why, and we'll discuss more in this segment, but that's one of the reasons why our federal prison system is just so overbloated and
Yep.
mismanaged, and has too many inmates in it
All
that
right.
are serving far too much time. And this is a mantra that federal judges themselves have been saying for decades, that there's too many people in prison serving far too much time. And now Sam Bankman-Fried is one of them also.
Yeah.
And merely because others have served longer does not justify
What
what he received, or justify what they received.
can I ask you though,
Yeah.
because I'd like to know, there are outliers like Bernie Madoff who
Yes.
received, 100 years, whatever. But like, have there
150
been
years. Yeah.
have 150 years, but have there been that many white collar fraud uh, defendants sentenced that have received a sentence even of this magnitude of 25 years?
No. And
Yeah.
that's a very good question. So,
He's on the
since
high side, right? I mean, in the
well,
history.
if you're looking at all sentences under 2B 1.1, which is the fraud guideline, okay, from 2002, and I did a study today of this. from 2002 to 2022, according to the U.S. Sentencing Commission's sentencing data, Sam Bankman-Fried's sentence of 300 months or 25 years is in the 99.6th percentile. Only 0.4% of all sentences under the fraud guidelines have been greater than his.
Yeah.
So he is
Okay. So he's way off
up
the
there.
charts.
He's way off the charts.
And I understand that the dollar figure was a driver in that because it's probably, I don't know if there's been a higher fraud loss calculated, but we were at like 10, 11, 12 billion dollars.
We were at $11 billion. Bernie Madoff was $13 billion.
Wow. And from like charities and old, like terrible, and his, well, we can go way into the facts of the case.
Well, Bernie Madoff, right? And just
egregious.
On that regard, yeah, Bernie Madoff was in it for over 20 years.
Yeah,
and that 13 billion, was more than Sam Bankman-Fried, according to the court yesterday. Judge Kaplan found that the loss amount was just over $11 billion. But when you're at that level, it doesn't make any difference under the guidelines.
Right.
To use Judge Kaplan's term, it's gravy. Once you get over $550 million, it doesn't matter for guidelines purposes or really sentencing purposes. And by the way, with respect to loss, the higher the loss amount goes, the crazier, I shouldn't say crazier, but the more disparate the sentences become, the less rhyme or reason they have, the less role loss has in what the sentence ultimately is. And I actually wrote an article on this back in 10 years ago for the Federal Sentencing Reporter that's still being cited today. The loss becomes meaningless the higher the loss amount goes.
Right. And the other thing, I know we're going to get into this later on life expectancy, but first of all, Madoff pled guilty, and it didn't matter. He was, I don't know how old he was old when he
71.
did it. Anything was probably going to be a life sentence for him. So if he gets 100 years or 150 years, I think in his mind, it's like, well, if that's going to make his victims feel a little bit better about everything, so be it. It doesn't matter to me. I'm dying in prison. So, but whatever, this in Sam's case was, and I've never seen anything like this. The offense level, so after you do loss, you've got a million other enhancements. It was like a level 60. Now, keep in mind, the chart only goes up to 43. Have you ever seen the off the chart numbers like that?
No. As a matter of fact, Bernie Madoff was only a 53.
Yeah, so this is like so far off the charts, which is, so that makes the sentence a little bit more understandable. Now you have to add in the fact that the judge was quite convinced that Sam obstructed justice and lied repeatedly, committed perjury on the stand. So in my experience, those are the things that are really gonna make life very, very, very difficult. And we're gonna talk about whether or not that was, there was some misunderstandings about Sam's motivations maybe later. But the truth is, once you've got obstruction and perjury, the judge has no love for you. The judge has nothing left to do but to hammer you 6 ways to Sunday. I believe that you probably would have gotten the bottle of tequila. If we didn't have the so-called perjury and obstruction counts, his sentence would have been significantly lower than 25. I don't know if it would have been quite as low as you thought, but it would have been closer to your range than mine.
Yeah, I think it certainly would have been closer to 15. I don't think it would have been anywhere around 12. And
no.
And well, let's kind of get into this. The first criticism that I have was the ask by defense counsel.
Oh, interesting. Refresh what's the ask?
So, well, actually, it's a criticism of both parties.
Oh, okay.
So
the ask. Go ahead.
The ask by the government as well as SBF's defense counsel. I criticize both.
Yeah.
And the first thing to start off with is understanding this. What did the guidelines recommend? The guidelines recommended in this case 110 years. So already the guidelines have taken themselves out of the conversation because 110-year sentence, and I realize Bernie Madoff got 150 years. That was absurd. That served no purpose. That was completely symbolic. Even Judge Chen who was the individual who sentenced Madoff at the time, he recognized that it was just symbolic. These symbolic sentences are absurd. They do not promote respect for the law. So what the guidelines were already, you're already starting off, the guidelines themselves were already taking themselves out of the conversation.
Right.
So that was clear. The probation officer, though, also took themselves out of the conversation because they came back and they had a recommendation of 100 years, 10 years off with the guy. That's still absurd.
Wholly
100
unhelpful
years,
for a judge. They're supposed to be
exactly,
helpful.
exactly. They're supposed to be helpful. So the government was proposing a sentence between 40 and 50 years, also absurd. But
it's not just absurd. It's grotesque.
It's grotesque. It's vindictive, and really it's unprincipled. There's no principle for why, and the only principle would be, well, other people got absurd, grotesque sentences like Bernie Madoff, so you should do this too, Judge. That is not a principle. That is just pure vindictiveness and arrogance, really, and it does not promote respect for law. But in that respect, one thing, and I will have to give a shout out to your friend and mine, Alan Ellis, because he has always reminded us of this. You have to be careful as defense counsel when you're going in about what you're asking for at sentencing, so you also don't take yourself out of the conversation.
Right.
And what the ask was here by defense counsel was only, I think it was about 6.5 years. And that was based on an argument. Now, 6.5 years doesn't necessarily take you out of the conversation in a high loss case like this, except for one big issue. It was the loss amount that the defense counsel was proposing. The government said $13 billion, or basically some amount over 550 million, which is the maximum under the guidelines. Anything over 550 million is treated the same, gravy in Judge Kaplan's term. But also the government, or the defense counsel, was arguing that there was no loss here. And that disparity between billions and none, that in and of that's gobsmacking. To even not take the bull by the horns, address the loss amount, and provide the court with something about why, even if the loss amount was $11 billion, why 40 years was absurd, 20 years was absurd, and provide some justification for the 6 years or 6.5 years, but don't come in and just completely ignore and say there's no loss here. The way I read the transcript, I think the judge was a little offended by that. And it certainly gave the both.
He was offended by the low ask. Is that what you're saying?
He was offended by the argument that there was no loss here.
Yeah.
I don't think he was offended by the low ask.
Okay.
I think he was offended, and that's what I'm getting at. It wasn't so much the low ask; it was why the ask was low, and the ask was low because the argument was there was no loss here.
And can I interrupt you though, because I have a relevant point in the transcript from the judge talking about this thing you're saying, which is, and we've been saying it a million times on a million different episodes of this, which is the guidelines are broken, they're useless, they're not based in reality, they're of no help to the judge, period.
Right.
And the Judge Kaplan essentially said as much. He said, I would say that the loss table, which is one of the significant driving forces of the guideline computation that I am obliged by law to do, though it's not binding on me, is a debatable proposition. Any number of my colleagues have criticized it on various grounds. As I understand its genesis, there's really no empirical basis for the brackets assigned or for the assignment of different losses to different brackets. So he's basically saying these guidelines suck. He was a little more diplomatic about it.
Yeah, but bravo to Judge Kaplan. Everybody should get this transcript. Everybody should be citing it in any high loss case. Absolutely. He says, I share many of those criticisms and concerns with my colleagues. I have never regarded myself, once Booker was decided, as in any way bound by the guideline computations that depend on the loss table in 2B 1.1. I do not regard myself as bound by it now. Right. And so he says, I'm going to, he didn't, this is at the beginning too. He said, I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to do, but I'm going to tell you right now, there's no fucking way I'm following those guidelines. Right.
He said, I'm going to vary downward from the guideline range that will be computed as a result of this process we're going through right now. So,
Right. But there was the softball.
significant.
Right. That was very significant. But there was the softball that I was just hoping Casey was going to glom onto. Yes, thank you, Judge. You're right. These guidelines are absurd. They are meaningless. They have no empirical support, especially in high loss cases.
Yeah.
Now what? The what should have been, and Judge, not only are you right, but this is why courts across the country are depart or vary downward from these guidelines significantly. And as a matter of fact,
Which
as
he
the
did.
law, well, no, he did, but the argument wasn't made, and the argument wasn't made by counsel that the loss, as the loss amount increases, the degree, the rate and degree of downward departures and variances increase significantly. And so that the reason why I think that was so important and a missed opportunity, because the judge, what the way I interpreted Judge Kaplan, what he was saying is, look, I ain't going to give him 110 years. I ain't going to give him 100 years. And as he said, I'm not going to even give him 40 or 50 years. But so what? If he gave him 30 years or 25 years, as we're going to find out, that's still a life sentence.
Yeah.
We need to start getting the judge not only focused off the guidelines, but how far to depart. And, you know, Judge Kaplan may think, you know what, I gave this guy a hell of a break. I gave him like an 80% downward variance. But an 80% downward variance from absurdity can still result in absurdity. And that's what happened here.
Well, let me speak to another thread of this loss amount, because you said you think the judge was a little bit offended about the argument that there really was no loss, because at the end of the day, there's a big pot of money that will be used, taken from the FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried, be used to make the victims whole. And he says, quote, to put it in more colloquial terms.
Yes, I love this.
A thief who takes his loot to Las Vegas and successfully bets the stolen money is not entitled to a discount on the sentence by using his Las Vegas winnings to pay back all or part of what he stole if and when he gets caught.
Yeah.
And so therein lies, I think, my first sort of plant the flag in the narrative hill that I want to talk about, which is this idea that the victims will be made whole may not get him out of a technical guideline increase for loss amount, but it's a story about mitigation. It's a story about culpability. It's taking control over the government's narrative, which is greed, no regard for everyone who's going to get hurt in his wake and everything else, to tell a story of one of the factors of what was SBF thinking? Well, he wasn't. He was just doing the math in his head. And one of the things that probably factored into the decisions that he may have been making was, whatever I'm doing here, the money's always there. No one's going to get hurt. I've always got the money to cover it. I'm making billions. And so it's a culpability thing to say, if I'm making bad decisions here, there's not going to be any real ramifications to the decisions, because nobody's going to get hurt. And I think that's where the story is about his intentions here, his culpability and his decision making. You're shaking your head like you don't follow.
Well, no. I agree with you. But this, I'm sorry, I'm having a conversation in my head too at the same time. But
it's just to circle the square where I'm going, and I'll keep peeling back the layers of it. But I've been banging the drum about autism spectrum disorder.
Right.
And one of the things about that is hyperfocus, rigidity, not being able to see the forest through the trees, and not being able to see the social implications of sort of rational, cold calculations that you're making in your mind.
Yeah.
And so I don't think Sam Bankman-Fried ever played out the worst case scenarios with whatever was happening here, to say, oh, what if this all went wrong, and then the government came in and seized all my assets, and then the bankruptcy people took over and took control of all these assets and shut these people out and blah, 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 blah. None of that is going through his mind. And that's a whole different way of walking the world than what Mukasey, I think, very aptly was talking about the assassins. He used this term about these cold-blooded, stone cold financial assassins, is what he said. So
Yeah,
to
but
people who are
unfortunately,
really that, you know,
that came back and bit him in the butt though, because the prosecutor used that.
yeah.
What
Well,
Mukasey said, and I know, but Mukasey said, SBF wasn't looking his victims in the eye like Madoff and
yeah,
others had. But the prosecutor pointed out, well, in this day and age, you don't need to have
yeah.
in-person contact. You can do it through Zoom, like we're
Yeah,
doing
you can
this.
do it
You
over
can do it
social media.
online, social
But
media,
it still
exactly.
begs the question of whether he intentionally sought to fleece victims and leave them penniless. Like Madoff knew very well what he was doing. And, I don't think he did. And I don't think that that story was ever told. I don't think they controlled the narrative there. And more importantly, I don't think they use autism spectrum disorder to help give it context. And for everybody that's saying autism is not an excuse for a crime, okay, fine. That's not what we're saying.
Right,
We're saying we have to give his actions context.
right.
We start by the actions that landed him with the indictment, and then we move through the actions that landed him in MDC awaiting trial because he violated the pretrial conditions of release. And then we go through what he's testifying to at trial, and then we go to what he's saying in court at sentencing because he can't help himself but to speak. And he dug a bigger hole for himself.
Oh
And
boy,
I am
did
here to tell you that if you look at it through the prism of the standard bullshit story the government tells in every single white collar case, which is narcissist, greed,
yes.
enriching themselves at any cost, no matter who gets hurt, throwing grandma under the bus to steal her life savings, they're as bad as any murderer, any rapist, and any child molester that walks the face of the earth. Okay, that's the standard story they tell in every case. And I'm here to say there's a different story, and it's not one that's going to excuse his conduct necessarily. It's not one that's going to let him walk free, but it's one that's going to give you a prism to view all of his actions in a different light. And that
It's a
is your
mitigator, right?
fucking
Right.
responsibility as a defense lawyer to not roll over this, to show that there's a different way to look at this to give it proper context.
Right.
And that is an epic failure in this case.
Yes. And on that point, and to your
Yeah.
point, the only person who even mentioned the word autism the entire time, it may have been the prosecutor one time, I'm thinking about, but Mulcahy never mentioned it.
Not
It
at
was
not at
only
the
the
hearing.
court, not at the hearing, not at the hearing,
He
not at
raised it in 2 pages of his 60-some page sentencing
Yeah.
memo, but only a small sliver of the story, and not even a well-told sliver, which is his autism will render him more vulnerable in prison.
Yeah. And that's only a small
That's
piece of it,
what
but
Kaplan glommed onto because that's what he said when he sort of offhand made reference to it in his.
yeah, well, rereading that portion of the transcript, I think Kaplan was just trying to throw SBF a bone and say, "Hey, don't put him in a high. Don't take him to the AdMax in Florence.
Yeah.
But a medium's okay." Oh my God, it's
Well,
it's gonna
yeah,
be
we're
all
going to talk about
yeah. We'll
that too,
talk.
the
We'll,
placement.
we'll talk about that. But
But
just
by the
just
way, I'll just so I've got while we're on the subject, so we
Yeah.
don't forget, I'll read you exactly what the judge said
yeah
when he was imposing sentence, because he was talking all in the context of his vulnerability
Yeah.
in BOP, and he talked about his notoriety and his resources and stuff like that. But then he said his autism and social awkwardness are
Yeah.
likely to make him more than usually vulnerable to misconduct by other inmates in the environment of a maximum security facility. Sorry, that's not just a maximum security. It's a
Exactly.
medium, it's
Yes.
a low, and it's
even a camp.
It is. But wait, he said, oh, he did say something else about autism. Sorry. That was his second mention of autism. But his first mention of autism was really weird because he talks about his privileged background. He was raised by loving parents. He had every advantage they could confront him.
I
He
remember,
went to the best private schools. He went to MIT. He is extremely smart. And he suffers from autism. which
Yeah.
is a condition, he says, I'm quoting, and
Yeah.
he suffers from autism, which is a condition that affects different afflicted persons very differently frequently. That's true. They say if you met one person on spectrum, you met one person on spectrum, fine. But this is what kills me. He
Mhm.
goes, I gather, is one is what one would call a very high achieving autistic person, which means, among other things, that he's capable of huge accomplishments. And he has frequently social awkwardness and a way of interacting with people that's unusual and sometimes off-putting. I take that all as a given. That's all he said about
So
autism.
it was almost, I mean, he was almost dismissing it. And so here, I mean, here's the point though. The only person that mentioned autism was Judge Kaplan. And it was
Yeah,
only, I have the transcript here. It's only
yeah,
mentioned three
yeah.
times in the entire sentencing hearing. But the point is, Kaplan got it, but it was like
No, he
only
didn't.
to a wait.
Okay.
He got it, but only to a point. So it was Mukasey, in a small sense, brought the horse to water, but
Yeah,
didn't make him drink. It says because Kaplan was able to recognize that, yeah,
right,
autism played a role here, and Sam's a little awkward, et cetera,
right.
et cetera, et cetera. But he didn't apply that own recognition when interpreting Sam's allocution.
Yeah.
I don't think he really appreciated the
Sam's trial
elocution.
testimony, Sam's
Exactly.
violation of
He
pretrial
did.
release.
He had the lens, but he didn't put it on. He understood that there was autism there, but nobody said, "Judge, got to put those
Yeah,
glasses on
right,
now. You're holding it.
right.
Put them on. Now you
And
can
here's
see."
and yes, and this is the epic failure, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, of the defense, because
Yeah.
the fact that that the defense lawyer raised this small sliver of vulnerability in prison, and that
Yeah.
message was received loud and clear by Judge Kaplan, tells you that any other message, had you delivered it, might
Yeah.
also have been received. If you don't tell the story, someone else is going to tell it, and you're not going to like it. And that's exactly what happened here with Judge Kaplan, because what was he saying with this high achieving autistic person? It means he's capable of huge accomplishments. It means that whatever your autism is, those quirks, that social awkwardness had nothing to do with your culpability, because
Yeah.
you are so brilliant. He says, I mean, he literally says he's a very high achieving autistic person. And guess what? The lawyer even fed Judge Kaplan in his allocution. He said, mind blowing intellect is the words that his defense lawyer used. So, what are you telegraphing to the judge? That Sam Bankman-Fried is deliberate. He is a genius. He knows exactly what he's doing all the time. He knows exactly the ramifications of his actions,
Yeah.
and he has every fucking thing coming to him because he's too goddamn smart to not know that what he was up to. And therein is the heart of our challenge when we have autism spectrum cases, because people think if you're so brilliant here, you have to be so brilliant there, and they don't realize that you have these massive blind spots and massive deficits.
Judge Kaplan took, obviously, the wrong message from all of this discussion about Sam's genius and his brilliance, et cetera,
Yeah.
because he used that against Sam. And that's part of the reason why he gave Sam such a high sentence, is because he could see him doing this again.
Yeah.
Judge Kaplan, towards the end of the sentencing, said that repeatedly.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Yes, because of this whole coin flip thing that
Yes.
he talked
Yes.
about.
Yes.
He basically, the judge said that is the centerpiece, that he called it
Yeah.
the leitmotif.
Yeah.
I guess
Right.
I've heard that terminology before, but it's
I thought it was
weird.
pronounced
But
leitmotif, even though
well,
whatever. I'm probably
okay.
wrong. I
But
mispronounce stuff all the time.
but he was, this is really fascinating, by the way,
Yeah.
but he was referencing Carolyn Ellison's testimony.
Yes.
She was the like secondhand banana who flipped on him and has a deal where we don't know what her sentence is going to be yet, but she testified that Sam said that he could flip a coin and he'd be happy to flip a coin. If it came up tails, the world was destroyed. As long as it came up heads, the world would be more than twice as good.
Mhm.
And the court says, in other words, as a quote, Judge Kaplan, in other words, a man willing to flip a coin as to the continued existence of life and civilization on Earth if the chances were imperceptibly greater that it would come out without that catastrophic outcome. That's really a leitmotif in my judgment on this entire case.
That was very unfair. That was so unfair for
It
him to,
was very
yeah,
unfair. And guess
and
what?
uncharitable. Just, jeez, yeah,
Right. And by the
yeah,
way, that was made in the context of Sam Bankman-Fried saying if that coin flip, if winning that coin flip meant the world was a much, much better place,
yeah,
because that was at his bone in his bones, his whole motivation for living was this effective altruism.
right,
But guess what? The fixation, the hyper focus on effective altruism and the fixation on probabilities and math and game theory, that's all
hmm,
his autism at work.
yeah,
He sees his mathematical genius is his superpower. It's what made him a billionaire. It's made him so effective, and it's his fucking kryptonite, all rolled
yes,
into
yes,
one.
yes,
And
yes,
they only focus on the superpower. And if that's his genius and his callousness and his lack of empathy for it, he'd rather see the world destroyed on a coin toss.
yeah.
You know, there was just so much wrong
First of
with the
all, he was
way.
being metaphorical, obviously.
Yes,
And to take somebody speaking loosely in
kills
private
me,
and metaphorically,
kills me.
eh, yeah, that was just so unfair. I was shocked when I read that.
Kills me.
Yeah. So okay.
Yeah.
So
All
what
right.
else? What else do we got? Well, let's
Ha!
we got a lot. So
Yeah.
one of the things I wanted to get to is the guidelines computation.
Yeah. Ha. Oh, the
And-
level 60 that doesn't even
yes.
exist.
Yes. So I'll just put it this way.
Got it.
I completely understand, and I would have done the same thing. Is just when it came to, do you have any objections to the guidelines calculation rested on the papers as both parties did? Totally get that. But again, I would have used that opportunity though to argue for variances and departures and rates and statistics and
Mhm.
brought up a whole bunch of empirical
Right.
evidence to show why even 25 years, let me put it this way. Judge Mark Bennett, former judge, he's in private practice now, and he wrote a very famous article several years back about the anchoring effect of the guidelines. And
Yes.
what he was referring to was the psychological anchor. And this happens to all human beings, not just judges, but all human beings. When
Yeah.
we're given a target, even if it's a target that is, in the case of the guidelines, just merely advisory, we subconsciously glom onto that, and that basically anchors our judgment. And so that's what has happened here, is the anchor for Judge Kaplan or anybody like any other federal judge
Yeah.
would be these absurd guidelines,
Yeah.
110 years.
And
And
by the way,
so
I don't want to interrupt, but I
yeah,
think in a case with this high profile, it's not just subconscious. I think there's a conscious sort of calculation that goes into the whole world is watching, and the guidelines say, 1,300 months. So even if I want to give him less, I'm going to be measured against this anchor because the
yeah,
public
and
doesn't
I
understand
think that's right.
how
And I think
wrong those are. But
yeah, and I think that's right. But that's the point. That's where counsel comes in and
yes,
give another anchor.
yeah.
Give another anchor.
Look at
So
this through a different lens. It's just like
yes,
the autism. And
thank you.
and yeah, fine, shameless plug. You've got it right on the wall behind you. It's sentencingstats.com. So
Right.
what would have been
So
a better way to frame these guidelines?
well,
Statistics behind the guidelines, I
right.
guess is better.
So here, I'm going to jump here. I don't have any fancy charts here because I was thinking about doing the fancy charts, but this is such a unique case, but I'm going to share my screen here.
And by the way, while you do that, I will
Yeah.
use this as a beginning sort of shot across the bow because I've been really enjoying watching the talking heads pontificate after this and marveling at how little qualifications some of them have. And so, when you come up here with your statistics, you've worked for the Sentencing Commission. You're a big brain with stats. This is your life's work. So, I just wish that the people that were actually spouting off about this in the public forum had the kind of background and expertise that that you did. But go ahead.
Thanks, Doug. Okay, so
Yeah.
what we're looking at here, this actually just came out yesterday. This is the latest quarterly report from the U.S. Sentencing Commission on their sentencing statistics. And this covers the last quarter of 2023, which is because the commission is on a fiscal year like the federal government is. It's the first quarter for 2024. And what I've highlighted here are just some averages, the mean, average, and median sentences for particular offense types.
Yeah.
And, as we can see here, I just would have said, you know what, Judge, here's an anchor. Let's all agree that this is not as serious as first-degree murder.
Yeah.
Okay. And let's see what the stats are. The 91 people that were sentenced under the murder guidelines, 2A 1.1, last fiscal, just the very last quarter, it was only 262 to 240 months. And let's look at a few other very serious violent offenses.
This is I just want to put a fine point on that and could just make sure it's not lost for the audience.
Yeah.
When you do statistical analysis, you're not just looking at 2B 1.1 fraud guidelines. What are the mean, medium, average sentence for someone who commits a crime like Sam Bankman-Fried? You're saying, let's look at other crimes. So for those of you not on the YouTubes, and what's pulled up here, there's 4 federal offense categories highlighted. The first one's child pornography, kidnapping, murder, and sexual abuse. So you just said murder. The average sentence for murder is less than what Sam Bankman-Fried received.
It is less than what Sam Bankman-Fried received.
Okay.
Yeah. So so what judges are supposed to do, one of the cardinal principles, the cardinal directives from Congress, is to sentence similarly situated individuals similarly. But there's a corollary that goes with that. That's also, you should not sentence dissimilar individuals similarly.
Yeah.
And really where that corollary is related to is also the seriousness of the offense. They're not supposed to just take into what do other people get that are similarly situated, but also how do you measure the offense seriousness? The only way to measure the offense seriousness is by comparing it to other uncontroversially or inarguably serious offenses. And the prima facie serious offense would be murder. And that's probably what we would consider the most serious out of all offenses. And that's why traditionally it has the highest sentencing, both on average and a median.
Yeah.
And here the average sentence was 262 months. And the median was 20 years or 240 months. Sexual abuse, 206 months. The median was 188 months. Kidnapping, 143 months was the average. 10 years was the median. And child pornography, which arguably is the most pernicious, ugliest of all federal offenses. And by the way, child pornography includes not just possession here, but also production.
Yeah.
Which carries a mandatory minimum of 15 years.
Yeah.
So mixing all of this together, the average sentence for child pornography was only 115 months.
Yeah.
Okay. That's less that Sam got more than twice as much as the average person for child pornography.
So here's what I will, not that Mr. Mukasey needs a defender, but I will say this, that I thought that it was somewhat effective for him. He did this in a tiniest little anecdotal way, which he brought up the case of some guy named Stefan Irving. And he said, to the judge, I think probably you, me, and Dan Gittner, whoever the fuck that is, are the only people who remember him. But Stefan Irving was a pediatrician who was a recidivist child sexual predator convicted in the state, then rearrested for traveling by the feds to Mexico to sexually assault prepubescent boys. To make matters worse, he'd been a pediatrician at a New York school district, so God knows what else he had been up to. And so no reasonable person would say that Sam is even half as dangerous or irredeemable or incorrigible or as bad as Stefan Irving, who got 21 years.
Okay. Actually, I like that comparison.
But
you still have to have
it's
statistics,
a one-off
because it's cherry picking. It's anecdotal, it's cherry picking, and for every 1 or 2 examples you can come up with, the government can come up with 10 or 20 anecdotal ones. The other route, like this guy was an angel, and this guy did this, and this guy did this, and
Right,
they had
yeah.
no criminal history, and their sentence was twice as much, and they got
Yeah.
40 years, and blah blah blah. So it doesn't help just to rely on anecdotes. I think anecdotes
Yeah.
are powerful.
Yeah.
Somebody once said something about storytelling and how important storytelling is.
Sure.
And
Details
I think,
matter.
and I agree. And this is part of the storytelling, but it's not complete.
No,
And
the completion would have been, and Judge, that story is not an anomaly. If you look at the statistics, everybody gets less.
bingo.
And
Bingo.
supported that in your written pleadings with charts and everything else to say,
Yeah.
I'm not just putting one isolated incident on the table. This is how it works, Judge.
Okay,
You
so
know
exactly. So that's one anchor. I would look at, okay, Judge, I want you to focus on really violent crimes, and let's see what they get, and that's going to be our anchor. And now we're going to come down from there. Instead of this absurdity of 110 years, we're going to start around the 20-year mark.
Yeah.
For murder. Now, but the other thing though is I like making it specific to the defendant. Now I'm going to come to the big thing that I always love talking about. Life expectancy.
Oh, goody. Can I set this up before you do that?
Sure.
Because well, okay, a couple of things. As I mentioned, I've been looking at some of the pundits and the talking heads, and there's some people in this space who are not lawyers and whose only real qualification to opine on some of these issues is that they've been convicted and sentenced to prison and in federal court. And I believe everyone's capable of redemption, but I also believe in staying in your lane and not giving a legal advice when you're not a lawyer. And there's two things that I noticed just yesterday. One is was one thing that they said, poo-pooing this life expectancy to say, well, that's not really a significant argument because the judge will just say, well, you should have thought about your life expectancy, when you committed the crime. But here's the other thing, because yesterday I posted a small blurb from our last podcast together on Sam Bankman-Fried when he was in trial. And you talked in depth about life expectancy in that podcast. And so the first little blurb of my post was your thing saying that anything over 17 years is a statistical life sentence. And so I would like to read, the comments are always so awesome on the social media, but I'd like to read you my favorite comment. So this is on TikTok. It's always so much fun to read this comment. So here it goes. Ready? Quote, "These guys," meaning you and me, "these guys are smoking dope." How'd you know?
Yeah.
Not at that moment. I mean, I must probably drink tequila, but you weren't.
No.
These guys are smoking dope. 31, which I guess is Sam's age. 31 plus 17 is 48. And you want me to believe that 48 is a life sentence? This is what is wrong with America.
I love it.
Okay, so would you like to explain your fuzzy math, Mark?
Yes, I would like to explain my fuzzy math, and I happen to agree with this guy that this is what is wrong with America. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's when somebody doesn't have any expertise and they just go with their own speculative intuition, and they think that they're the experts, and they haven't even looked at the data or even have any remote competency to comment on this. So anyway, so here I'm gonna here's the life expectancy chart. So the first thing I wanted to say, I'm gonna plug Dr. Evelyn Patterson, who's now out of Georgetown. This is based on,
just for the record, you're not high right now, right?
No, I'm not high. But
you're not high.
I'm a little upset.
Okay, and you, unlike me, have I see no drink by your side.
No drink.
This is a 1,000% sober Mark Allenbaugh about to lay down the truth.
Here's the truth.
Speak, brother.
So Dr. Evelyn Patterson, back in 2013, peer-reviewed, published article, did a study of hundreds of inmates and found that on average, and this is inmates that are spending years in prison, not somebody going in for a few months and stuff like that. Serving a long prison term of several years at least, that on average, they lose 2 years of their life expectancy for every year in prison. Her publication has been cited by several courts across the country, federal and state, including federal appellate courts, including 3 state Supreme Courts, have cited her study and with respect to some sentencing issue, sometimes even in capital cases. But I think it was Michigan may have cited her study with respect to overturning a juvenile who had been sentenced to life in prison without parole, and discussing how the effect long-term imprisonment on life expectancy. So it's not it's a very credible study that courts across the country have recognized. And so what I've done here is I've applied her study using the Social Security Administration's estimate of Sam's life expectancy without prison. Okay, without prison as of this year, he's 32 this year. He's expected to live, if he wasn't in prison, until 81.5, which, by the way, what's really interesting, that's that green line you see going across the top. That your life expectancy actually, you're not in prison, actually increases once you hit certain milestones in your life. So once you get to be 62, for somebody like Sam, your life expectancy actually goes up a little bit. And then once you get to 66, it goes up even more. So by the time he's 7, right now, his life expectancy is expected to live to be 81 and a half. But by the time he gets to 70, it's going to be 86.8 years. So here's the point. So that's the life expectancy. And by the way, I have run this analysis by Dr. Patterson herself. She has blessed this. This is what she meant. And this is how you interpret her data.
Yeah.
So, what the green line is his current life expectancy. The blue line is his age. And this is, hopefully it's not too sophisticated for some of our TikTok viewers out there, but for every year you live, your age goes up by 1 year. So that blue line is just showing that he started out at 31. The reason why I started it in 2023 is that's when Judge Kaplan remanded him. His bail was revoked because of some communication he was having with an old general counsel. So that's when his prison term started. So 2023. So he was 31 at the time. He's 32 now. So the orange line shows you how his life expectancy diminishes by 2 years for every year he's in prison. So the first year it goes down 2 years, second year it's going down an additional 2 years, so on and so forth. So you just follow that orange line down to where it intersects with the blue line, and that's his life expectancy, approximately 17 years, or to 2040. That's when he would be expected to die. And by the way, I'm going to just jump ahead for 1 second. I'm going to show you some data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, U.S. Department of Justice, that corroborates all of this. So this is just Mark and it is beautiful looking graph using Dr. Patterson's study. This is also the Department of Justice itself, the data that it has collected on how long inmates last in federal prison.
Both of these, by the way, if we haven't already put a fine point on it, were not raised in any way, shape, or form, not even a little bit, in defense memo or oral argument.
No.
So judge doesn't. This judge is smart and capable and qualified, and he likely has no idea that he gave Sam Bankman-Fried a life sentence.
No, he doesn't.
A potential life sentence. And then the only question that remains,
it's a statistical life sentence.
I mean, you're right. But if 25 years with good time and credit for whatever, he's probably looking at in ballpark 18 years left to serve on a sentence. So that's obviously over 18. Last I checked is one more than 17 for the TikTok crowd.
Right.
But the point is, he didn't know that when he gave him the sentence. And the only open question then becomes, would he have cared? And I mean, that's anybody's guess.
So what? But here's why he should have cared, because remember those cardinal rules that Congress told judges that they have to do. You have sentence similarly situated defendants similarly. You got to sentence according to the seriousness of the offense. But the big overarching grand poobah directive is the principle of parsimony. You should sentence sufficient but not greater than necessary to meet all these other purposes of sentencing, such as reducing unwarranted disparity, seriousness of the offense, and all this other stuff. So the argument then goes, and I think this is the ultimate argument, why life expectancy is so important in so many cases. Because how can you achieve the principle of parsimony to give a sentence that exceeds someone's life expectancy? So, for example, there was no way in hell that Bernie Madoff's 150-year sentence complied with the directives of 3553A. No way in hell. Nobody lives to be 150. Even if you sentence Bernie Madoff and he started serving his time the second he was born, could he have lived that long for that sentence? So the point simply is that if you're going to try to impose a sentence that is as minimal as possible, which is the principle of parsimony, to achieve all these other directives, to achieve all these other principles of sentencing, then you must take into consideration life expectancy.
By the way, I did just Google, and Moses lived to 100 to be 120 years old. FYI.
Well, there you go. So even Moses could not have served Madoff's sentence.
Yeah.
And frankly, even Moses probably couldn't serve Sam's sentence either. So just for all the doubters out there, I added in a couple of little other color parts of the chart. So you'll see this red part there. With the red part, this little red rectangle, it says good conduct time credit. So as we know, everybody that receives a sentence, or almost everybody, will get 15% off of their sentence once they're in federal custody.
Yeah.
So Sam received a sentence of 25 years. So that's going to start back in August of 2023 when he was first remanded. He's going to get credit for all of that. So that means he'll be released sometime, or his sentence will run, his statutory sentence, as they say, will run sometime in August of 2048. That will be 25 years. But because he's going to get 15% off of his sentence for good conduct time, that's going to be reduced to sometime around 2044. That's still beyond his life expectancy. So that good conduct time isn't going to help him. Now, lucky for him, there's something called the First Step Act and the Second Chance Act. Now, this, I don't know, I don't have too much faith in this particular calculation. It's a very liberal calculation about how much additional credit he may receive. But even stretching it out, that might get him down, that might get him out sometime in the middle of 2037, which, lucky for him, will be before his life is extinguished, before he dies in prison. But that's a big maybe. And once he gets out, he'll still only have a few years left. One thing, I don't have it here, and I don't have the citation, but your viewers and your listeners can Google this, but there is a recent study out of the University of Michigan based upon Michigan state inmates. And there's no reason to believe that they're any qualitatively different than federal inmates. But what the study showed is that on average, these inmates, these state inmates, 30% of them wound up dead within 5 years of being released from prison. And the reason why, and these were long-termers. I think they had served at least 10 years or something along those lines. And the reason why is because prison is not a very healthy environment, physically or mentally. And it has some very deleterious effects on your body and your mind that don't just disappear the second you walk out of prison. And it continues. And so whether it's by suicide or because there was medical care that wasn't attended to while they were in prison, or what
trauma, not a good exercise, not enough sunlight, not like all the deprivations.
All the deprivations.
Really about.
So 30%, that would be like a 70%. If they had cancer, that would be like saying there's a 70% survival rate once you exit prison after you've served approximately 10 years. that's worse than prostate cancer.
Yeah.
And that's up there with like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And that has about a 73% survival rate. So in many real respects, a long-term in prison is like getting a diagnosis of cancer. Just put it another way, your survivability, even once you're out, you're not out of the woods. I guess that's ultimately what I'm saying here. So the point ultimately of all of this is I would have certainly taken the bull by the horns with respect to what the court was saying about the guidelines, the loss table, and all this stuff. Okay, Judge, we're throwing all of that out. Ignore all of that stuff. But I want you to forget that anchor too, because it's meaningless. Here's two new anchors for you. One is very serious, violent sexual offenses. What are these folks getting? That's going to be our ceiling. And now also, let's look at how much time Sam really does have, because he's going to be serving a long term in prison. Even 25 years, as I mentioned to you, that is in the 99.6th percentile for everybody that's been sentenced under the fraud guidelines since 2002.
Yeah.
So this is a very significant, unusual sentence, even though it might be 80% off of the guidelines. It's still an absurd sentence. And then finally, I know I'm kind of on a roll here, but
That's good.
This next slide here, what this is showing is persons that exit federal prison. This is something that the Bureau of Justice Statistics has relatively recently provided. This is something that I've been corresponding with Mark Motivans. He's one of the lead statisticians over there at BJS. And this is a great new tool, a relatively new tool, that people can hop on and utilize to verify everything that I'm saying. And this is coming from the Department of Justice itself. And what this shows here is everybody from 2006. And can you see this? It says persons exiting federal prison and all this.
Yep.
Okay.
And for our listeners, you got to go to the YouTubes and check this out, because there's some good charts here. But go ahead.
Okay, so this is going from 2006 through 2022. And by the way, this goes all the way back to 1998. But I'm focusing really on the post-Booker period of time here. So from 2006 through 2022, there were 66 males, white males, who were sentenced under the guidelines. That's what this SRA case means, who were sentenced between 241 and 360 months. There really wasn't a lot. There were 66 of them. And this is how they left prison. There were 66 who left. I mean, there are more who were actually sentenced, but 66 who were sentenced to that period of time, who have left prison sometime between 2006 and 2022. And what this table shows you is how they left. 22.7% of them, of these 66, or 15 of them, left by death. That means more than 1 in 5 did not survive their sentence. Another 22.7%, left because they received compassionate release. And you know that those are very recent ones, because compassionate release was almost non-existent prior to the pandemic, prior to 2019. It didn't really become a thing until 2020, last 4 years. So only 1/3 actually served their full sentence, and that's what that good conduct time release means.
We don't have any specifics behind those deaths, though. Is it old age? Is it suicide? Is it cancer? Do we know?
We don't know. We don't know. I'm trying to get that data, but none of those.
Murder. They've been killed in prison.
Yeah, they could have been murder. It could have been suicide.
Suicide rates are ridiculously high. We've talked about that before.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
And so one last table here. So this is probably probably the best way of getting a handle on the life expectancy of inmates in federal prison, regardless of sentence. And I've always wondered about this. I mean, I know people get different sentences, of course. Some get, a few months, some get a few decades, and some get life. But even those, what is the maximum amount of time that, somebody can get sentenced to life, but how long do they really live when they're in prison? What's the outer end of life expectancy in prison? So what this is showing you is the answer to my question. This shows you from 1998 through 2022, there were 411 lifers for any type of offense. They were sentenced to life, not death, life, or the way I like to say it, death by prison, as opposed to death by execution.
Yeah.
So there's 411 of them that left federal prison. This shows you how 411 of them that left by death. I didn't show this other slide, but there was like 600 something lifers that left federal prison. Most of them, it was like 68% left by dying. And the rest either received compassionate release or they had a commutation. So 1/3 compassionate release commutation of the lifers, so they don't really count for life expectancy. But the rest, the other 2/3, they died. So when did they die? How long did they survive in federal prison? And that's what this highlighted section shows here. 21.9% died between 5 years and 120 months of their service in prison. Again, they're serving an undeterminate amount of time. It's a life in prison, and as we know at the federal level, there is no parole. So they're there until they die. So how long did they last?
Between 5 and 10 years.
Yeah, basically 21.9% between 5 and 10 years, 41.1% between 10 and 20 years. In other words, over 60%, about 63% did not survive beyond 20 years. That's the life expectancy. That doesn't mean everybody died, but the majority, the vast majority of defendants, when they are sentenced to life, regardless of age, and regardless of age, they're not going to last beyond 20 years, regardless of offense type, regardless of age, regardless of race, all this other stuff. They're not going to last beyond 20 years. Only 1 in 5 last beyond 20 years, but they don't even last beyond 30. Almost nobody lasted beyond 30 years. That's what you'll see a little arrow there. That means there are less than 10 defendants that fit that particular category. So there's no statistic provided because there were so few. And it could have only been 1 or 2 that lasted that long. But nobody goes beyond 30 years. And most people, like Sam, are not going to last beyond 20 years.
Yeah.
And let's for 25. Okay.
And let's segue this into telling the story of prison at sentencing, because the life expectancy is all based on how goddamn hard it is to be in prison every day, every hour of every day. There was some discussion about the designation, and a lot of lawyers don't realize how vitally important it is to come in having really considered what is going to be their BOP score, what kind of facility can they qualify for, what are the relevant facilities, so you can get the judge to recommend. They don't have, BOP doesn't have to follow it, but the recommendation from the judge is very important, and Judge Kaplan knows this, and he took all of this stuff about autism and high notoriety and resources of Sam Bankman and his social awkwardness, blah, blah, blah. And he said, I strongly, it reminds me of that scene in A Few Good Men where she said, I vigorously object, or I strongly object. And they're like, oh, you strongly object? But he strongly recommend to the Bureau of Prisons that that defendant, I hate when they call our clients defendant. Can you not just use his name? He's a human being. I strongly recommend to Bureau of Prisons that defendant be designated initially to a medium security facility or any lower security institution that BOP considers appropriate. And I do so for 2 reasons: notoriety and autism, social awkwardness. Okay. So were there any what's your take about this designation recommendation?
Well, I would have done everything that I could to dissuade the court from mentioning a medium security facility. Now, certainly he's going to be scored out there because of the length of his sentence, but the court still could make a recommendation, and the BOP could choose to follow it or not, but a recommendation for a low because of these reasons. Going to a medium is not doing SBF any favors. He's going to be there with with gang members, hardened criminals, if you will. He's not going to be with other white collar offenders, and certainly not first timers. He's going to be with a lot of recidivists too, and they're going to know who he is. And so he's going to be under a lot of danger. So he's probably going to end up spending a lot of time in the SHU
Yeah.
for his own good, for the special housing unit or solitary confinement. And that's just that.
And yeah, and listen
Yeah.
to this. So you hit the nail on the head, because once a judge says, I strongly recommend a medium or lower,
Yeah.
that's a problem.
Yeah.
And the reason is because the BOP actually doesn't have to give him a medium. He may be scored that way, but unlike the bogus prison consultants that want to talk about things, Dunning-Kruger things, we consult with experts who actually, their qualification is they've spent their life inside the BOP, but not as inmates, as actually running the places. And so,
although the inmates tend to run places too.
well, that's true too. But basically, the BOP has the option to waive what is called his public safety factor. In other words, the sentence length may put him in the medium designation range, but the BOP, if they don't have to do that, because they can waive what's called the public safety factor. So a strong recommendation for a low or lower would have been ideal. And the bigger problem is, I read this transcript as somehow saying that Judge Kaplan believes that in a medium facility, he's going to be, well, he says it. He says his autism and social awkwardness are likely to make him more than usually vulnerable to misconduct by other inmates in the environment of what? We said it earlier, a maximum security facility. Can this judge who's been on the bench since 1994 really be so oblivious as to believe that it's only in a maximum security facility that Sam Bankman-Fried is going to be vulnerable to misconduct by other inmates?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's absurd.
That was, yeah.
And so he either, and I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, because I don't think judges have an understanding of what life is like in BOP for our inmates. I don't think most of them care to know. And we've done a whole podcast on that too. But the truth is, a medium security facility, it may not be just as bad, but it's going to be bad. And our prison experts would have, through affidavit or testimony at sentencing, very clearly conveyed to the judge how dangerous, how vulnerable Sam would have been in a medium level facility. And the level of violence that's often consistent with that occurs in the higher level, what we call penitentiary. And basically, the medium is full of inmates who have worked their way down, who have spent a lot of time in the highs, right?
Yeah.
And they're very adept at manipulating, exploiting, and abusing newer, more vulnerable inmates. And guess what? Same deal for low. And you and I have had clients in camps. Everybody thinks camps a country club, and it's, you're playing pickleball and shit. The same shit is going on at the camps now. It wasn't maybe always like that, but with the way that BOP is functioning or not functioning right now, he's vulnerable everywhere, but he's far more vulnerable in the medium than he would be in a camp.
Well, like I said, he's going to end up in the SHU there.
Yeah, and which is solitary confinement.
Right, and that's going to mess with is going to make any mental health issues he's suffering with right now even worse. And
I'd like to see the life expectancy analysis for people, correlate that to how much time they spend in segregation in solitary.
Yeah, that's
because it makes you crazy. Yeah, make a note of that. So anyway, who knows where he's going to go?
I think most likely he's going to go to Mendota. That is the closest. That's the closest medium that has room. The closest medium that has room to the Bay Area.
To where his family is. So
to the Bay Area. There's Furlong, but that's over capacity, and then there's Victorville down in Southern California. But there's two facilities at Victorville, but they're also over capacity. But Mendota, for some reason, was over capacity during the pandemic, but now has some capacity. But still, it's going to be it's a medium facility, and that is not going to be a good place for him to serve any time. It would be much better for him to go down to the camp in Lompoc down in Santa Barbara, but he's not going to, his public safety factor is going to keep him out of a camp, unfortunately. But there is a low
At least
down
at the
there.
outset.
At least at the outset, right. Eventually he'll end up at a camp,
Mhm.
but the sooner he gets to one of those places, the better.
Right.
And one of the things I was going to say too, that people may not know is when an inmate does end up in segregation, they lose pretty much all communication with the outside world,
Yeah.
even with their counsel. So, there's no visitation, there's no phone calls except maybe once a week for a few minutes. There's no core links, which is the email system that they have. And, they're spending 23 hours a day in that tiny little cell.
And my
With maybe
guess is they're not programming, so they're not earning First Step Act
exactly,
early
yeah,
release credits too. So
right.
their sentence
Yeah.
gets longer. So
Yeah.
anybody who thinks that life's going to be easy for him in any way, shape, or form is deeply misinformed.
Yeah.
A couple other things, because we're going long, but I knew we were going to go long because there's so much to talk about. But there are other sentencings to look forward to. There are three co-defendants who all pled, cooperated, and helped significantly in securing this conviction against Sam Bankman-Fried. But they're deeply culpable. They were in it right alongside with him, and they have yet to be sentenced. It's Carolyn Ellison, Nishad Singh, and Gary Wang. And I don't know when their sentencings are set. I'm not going to ask you to make any predictions. Obviously, they're going to get a lot of less time for a lot of reasons, but mostly the cooperation is what gets in the federal system. That's the currency, but also pleading guilty and early and everything else. But I will be very interested to watch that and see, because there's some talk that one or all of them won't see a day inside of prison. I would be surprised by that.
I would be surprised too.
But I have a feeling that might be a follow-up podcast for us once that happens. And then the last thing I think we need to talk about, well, probably not the last thing. I will say this. I want to give Mukasey some props, because there was something that happened at the sentencing that I thought was kind of fun and seemed very well orchestrated and highly effective to me. And that is at the portion of the sentencing where the victims got to say their piece. And the government, you might recall, only called one guy who was not only a victim, but he was kind of the voice he was representing some of the other victims, and his name was Sunil Kavuri.
I think there were two witnesses.
Well, there were,
yeah,
but I wasn't clear. I'm going to talk about the second one, but so the first one was his main thing. A big thrust of it wasn't about Sam. It was about the bankruptcy lawyers and how badly they were fucking the victims, which I thought, in a sense, that's on Sam, because he starts this chain of events, and there wouldn't be these bankruptcy lawyers. But there is a whole untold story of how these other lawyers have been cannibalizing all the funds and really mismanaging that. So he was so shitty that the judge was basically like, I think it's time for you to shut the fuck up.
Right.
And he literally said, I think it would be helpful if you could bring your comments to a close soon. You're not doing well when a judge tells you that, whether you're a victim. I mean, and a judge very rarely would say something like that to a victim, because usually the tenor is, well, they're a victim. I'll let them say their piece and then they can go. But he basically said, it's time for you to shut the fuck up.
Yeah, well, the guy had been rambling on for several minutes, so I understand that.
And then the court, this is what I thought was so interesting. The court says, thank you very much for shutting the fuck up, Sunil. Anyone else? He goes. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this guy, Mr. Moskowitz, jumps up and says, Your Honor, I would like to. And I don't know where Mr. Moskowitz came from, but I suspect that this is a tip of the hat to Mark Mukasey, who said, I want this guy to say his piece, because he jumped up and he's basically, it looks like he's representing, he says, thousands of customers. So maybe it's a class action or it's a plaintiff's lawyer. And the thrust of his thing was, Sam Bankman-Fried has been enormously helpful in helping these plaintiffs recover their money.
Yeah.
And he was in the victim statement thing, but his whole thing is his cooperation has been incredibly helpful. Sam and his team have been helpful to us. And these insiders have been so helpful. He said it over and over again. And I was like, wow. I don't know where this guy came from, but I don't think the government asked him to say all that stuff. I think that was behind the scenes, Mukasey saying, get in there
Mm.
and say your piece. That's what
Wow.
I think.
Wow.
And
Well,
if that's the case, good
yeah.
job, man.
Yeah, that's some 4D chess right there.
Good
Yeah.
job.
Yeah.
Good
That's some
job.
4D
And
chess.
by the way, you should have kept going with that motif, that liet motif, which is this is how remorseful and deeply upset Sam Bankman-Fried is, that he is now he's a guy who's famous for singular focus, hyper focus,
Mhm.
perseveration. This is his singular focus to do everything he can to make sure not only do they get the money that they lost, but the money that they would have made had they still been in the markets and the crypto went up.
Yeah.
And that would have should have been just hammered, 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 hammered. And he set the stage with this dude in the victim side. I'm like, keep going with that.
Yeah.
And that leads me to the last thing, which is we heard from Sam Bankman-Fried, he
Mm.
allocated,
Yep.
which
Good.
is
I'm glad you're
always
bringing this up.
which
Yeah.
is always an interesting thing when you go to trial because you've got an appeal. This is
Mhm.
another thing that I don't like with the talking heads who are in the Dunning-Kruger, who think they're lawyers, who basically on their YouTube saying, "Well, I don't care if he's got an appeal pending. I think he should just admit to everything and show remorse." It's like, okay, well, you're not a lawyer, so thank you. I would quote the judge who would say, um, "I think it's time for you to sit down and shut the fuck up." Anyway,
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing, but anyway, but Sam Bankman-Fried did allocute, and I just wanted to get your 2 cents on that.
Well, and thanks for asking because I
You're
do want to address
welcome.
that.
My
Um,
pleasure.
so yeah, obviously because first of all, I was surprised he allocated
Yeah.
because he went to trial and he's going to appeal. And there's really, really the only thing allocutions generally do is even when you plead, is just make it worse for the client,
Yeah.
unless the client is well prepared.
Yeah.
And most sentencing, as we know, they occur after a plea, not trial. And trial is, it's a different issue if you're going to appeal. And so again, surprised he did allocute. I think he went on too long. It didn't seem to me like he was prepared. He was rambling a lot, and he said a lot of things that if you did not have your Sam Bankman-Fried glasses on
Yeah.
and just had you were going to misunderstand him. And I think unfortunately that's what happened because he kept talking about mismanagement. He mismanaged this and he mismanaged that. And to the untrained observer, it would seem that he was explaining away his culpability, and it was as if really what he was sorry about wasn't his criminal conduct, which he really should be apologizing for, frankly, if he's going to appeal, but
Right.
more the fact that he wasn't the best manager in the world.
Yeah.
That he didn't live up to the high expectations that he had for himself, and that's what he was sorry for. And that's the way it kind of would read. And I don't think he did himself any favors at that on that.
Yeah.
But there's one part that I did like, and that before I turned it over back to you,
Yeah.
there's one part I did like, and it wasn't what the press keep quoting. The press glommed onto his statement that at the end of the day, my useful life is probably over. It has
Yeah.
been over for a while now. Now that sound, that I was like, oh God, that sounded awful. Almost sounded suicidal to me, to be honest
Yeah.
with you. And I didn't like, I did not like the sound of that. Not because I think it hurt Sam. It's because I hurt for him when he said that. It just
Yeah.
felt almost desolate, like he's almost given up. But I don't think that's what he meant by it.
Yeah.
Um, but what I did like was the way he ended. And if he was going to allocute, I wish it would have been just this, just short, sweet, and impactful, and
Yeah.
not give the emotion out there, but without any fodder to the government or to even the court to misapprehend or misinterpret what you're trying to say. But this is what he said. This is how he ended up. And I thought this was beautiful. and this should have been it.
Yeah.
I guess there was a big opportunity in the world to do what the world thought I would do, what it hoped I would do, at least for a while. What I hoped I would do for the world, not what I ended up doing. And
Yeah.
300 people that I used to work with, incredibly talented, selfless, impressive people, were looking for something to do. If that happens, if they do what they could for the world, then hopefully I'll be able to see their success,
Yeah.
not just my own failures each night.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I love that. That would have
Really
been it.
good.
Yeah.
Really good.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there was another little blurb that I loved too, which I don't dispute if that's all he said and sat down.
Yeah.
Because you have to understand, you have to know that there's nothing that he can say up there that's going to make his situation significantly better. He
Correct.
can only make himself worse. And that's exactly what
Correct.
happened, because
Yes.
the judge basically hammered on, you still have never said you're sorry. You still have never
Right.
admitted you've done anything criminal. You have no remorse.
Right.
You know. But he did say, I was the CEO of FTX. I was its leader. That means I was responsible for what happened to it. At the end of the day, I was responsible.
Mhm.
And that's it. I mean, the judge understands you have some factual disputes about the culprit, but whatever, but you're accepting responsibility in this small sliver of a way. And you come back to, I have been working tirelessly to make the victims whole, and I will continue to do that until the day I die.
Yeah.
And you already have a dude that stood up at the beginning of this hearing that said, yeah, he's really been working hard to make everybody whole. That's what he wants. So you've got, I'm responsible and I'm going to fix this problem. That's a hell of a lot better than all the other stuff that went
Yes.
along with it.
I guess my last comment is that I hope people don't say that he got a 25-year sentence. Let's call it what he got: death by prison. And
Yeah.
I think we really need to start thinking about prison that way when
Yeah.
we're talking about sentences in excess of 20 years.
Yeah.
It's death by prison. If
Yeah.
you happen to survive, you're damn lucky, but
Yeah.
it's luck. Otherwise,
Yep.
you're dead.
Yeah. And every day is going to suck
Yeah.
for the next 2 decades. So,
Yeah.
ah, man. Well,
Okay, brother.
happy Friday. Happy Good Friday.
Well, thank you.
And I will talk with you soon.
Okay.
That's it for today. But before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassenlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.